Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. Coming up on today's program, a thaw between Japan and China. Japanese Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida continues a three-day visit to China, officially aimed at repairing bilateral relations amidst Chinese disapproval of Japan's move toward non-pacifism. Can the two nations build trust? And we sit down on the sidelines of SICA with Morteza Sarmadi, who is the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs from Iran. He shares some thoughts on the challenges facing the implementation of Iranian nuclear deal and how the Road and Belt initiatives could impact Sino-Iranian ties. Japanese Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida kicks off his three-day official visit to China. It's the first trip by a Japanese foreign minister in 4.5 years to China and is seen as a bid to restore momentum to ties between Asia's two largest economies. Mr. Kishida is set to meet his counterpart Wang Yi and other senior officials during the visit. Could this be the prologue of resuming high-level exchanges between these two neighbors? Before we turn to our panel, let's take a look at this.
A rare official visit. Japanese Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida starts a three-day visit to China today for the first time in the second term of Abe's government, paving the way for further high-level exchanges between Tokyo and Beijing amid strained relations. Ahead of his trip, Mr. Kishida stressed the need to improve Sino-Japanese ties in a speech delivered at the Yomiuri International Economic Society in Tokyo. Through a series of dialogues with Beijing, he hopes to build China-Japan relations suitable to what he calls the new era. The Chinese Foreign Ministry responded to this speech on Wednesday.
Relations between China and Japan are seeing an improvement, but they also face its challenges. We hope Japan can handle the relevant issues in an appropriate manner and make concrete efforts for the sustainable, healthy, and stable development of bilateral relations.
High-level exchanges between the two countries have been tense since 2012, when Japan asserted a claim on the Diaoyu Islands, territories also claimed by China. China has also pushed back against the Abe government's historical view of the Second World War, in particular regarding the Nanjing massacre and the issue of comfort women. Japan's historical views have caused tension not only with China, but with South Korea. After Japan's new security law took effect last month, Tokyo has become more involved in the South China Sea disputes. It dispatched a submarine and 2 escort warships near disputed waters during the U.S.-Philippines drill. At the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Hiroshima earlier this month, Japan voiced its concerns over issues in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Sino-Japanese bilateral ties have seen ups and downs in recent years. Could this visit be the first step to improving relations between the two neighbors?
And that is an interesting question. More discussion on that. We are joined here in the Beijing studio by one Chinese guest and one Japanese guest. From the Chinese side, Mr. Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Also joining us here, Mr. Ken Jimbo, Associate Professor from the Faculty of Policy Management of Keio University. Also joining us from Tokyo in Japan, we are having Professor Takasato Watanabe. He's a Professor Emeritus at Doshisha University. Welcome as well, Professor. Gentlemen, this is a big day, shall I say, for China-Japan relations. 4.5 years for the two foreign ministers to meet, particularly here in Beijing, is a rare thing. Not to mention the top leaders of the two countries. First of all, Professor Jimbo, Japan talking about a relationship with China, quote unquote, in a new era. Exactly how would you characterize this new era?
Well, Foreign Minister Kishida had a lecture a couple of days ago in Tokyo and specifically focused on the Japan-China relationship. In there, he actually characterized China as a strategic partner and then need to have a win-win relationship after all. So we perceive China as a great power right now, and in between Japan and China, that is a relation between major powers. This is something like a new characterization of how we see the two bilateral relationships.
Is that wishful thinking or only rhetorical?
Well, I think it is a reality. China has surpassed the GDP of Japan in 2010, and it has become a rival. At the same time, it is a strategic partner after all.
All right. Professor Watanabe, I know sometimes we have different views from Japanese panelists. What about you? Is it realistic that the Japanese foreign minister coming to China this time, despite all of these disputes about history, about territorial disputes, and about how the two countries will find their strategic positions in Northeast Asia, be able to achieve this rosy picture?
The public opinion of Japanese people is very important in the connection of the visit of Mr. Kishida. Public opinion of Japan, especially women with young children, the supporting rate for Prime Minister Abe's cabinet is getting lower and lower. So something should be taken by the government, and one of them is the Mr. Kishida's government visit to China. In addition, we had recently very, very serious big earthquake in Kyushu Island. So these things put the some movement toward the Abe's administration, including Kishida's visit.
I see. Domestic politics, of course, play a very important role these days in any country's international affairs. But Mr. Yang, according to an editorial coming from China's official Xinhua news agency, it said, and I was reading it before coming into the studio, interesting quote, the ball is in the court of Japan. Do you think that is the case? What Japan needs to do so that China could feel the other side is sincere? And what Professor Jimbo just mentioned just now, the beautiful goals set forward by the foreign minister, at least in the public speech, can be achieved, Mr. Yang?
Yeah, actually, the quotation you mentioned means the four basic documents in the bilateral relation remain unchanged.
Okay, let's go to the history. Four basic documents, what are they?
Well, from 1972, that is the first documents which China-Japan joint declaration that set up the base for the normalization. That is the most important thing, in which there's an article by saying Japan recognize and commit to abide by the Potsdam Declaration, especially the Article 8, something like that.
What does that mean?
That means Japan accept the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Declaration, returning Taiwan and all the related territory taken by Japan during the war time, return to China. And that also means the right acknowledge about history.
Right.
And because that is that's the base for the world order.
Okay.
So, and following the three documents illiterate the base and the guidelines for the win-win bilateral relation between the two great countries.
So what are the crucial points that the Chinese side seem to be demanding or observing, if I could use another word?
Well, basically, let me say, shortly speaking, three problems now in bilateral relation.
Go
two
ahead.
old, one new. Two old is a historical issue, everyone knows. And the second old one issue is the disputes on Diaoyu Islands. But on historical issue, as I mentioned, the first document has set up the base, say, Potsdam Declaration, and Diaoyu Island disputes. Zhou Enlai and the then Prime Minister, Tianzhong, I cannot pronounce anyway, the then politicians were very smart.
Okay.
They arranged the side-by-side disputes and seal or freeze this issue.
You said two olds and one new. What
The
is
new
the new one?
new one is the recent constant efforts by Japanese Abe administration in South China Sea. It seems to China that Japan is trying to forge a so-called united front against China from the East Sea to South Sea, although both of the issues from the two seas are totally different.
Okay, now let's go to you, Professor Jimbo. You need to respond to this. Revisionism That is the thing. Let's start from there. Of the history book, of the basic constitution, which has been Pacific, and now it is much more non-Pacific. So is Japan going to fulfill China's expression in this regard?
Well, I think if you look at track records of the Abe administration, Prime Minister Abe has been quite patient, moderate, and taking pragmatic steps towards those nationalism and historical issues. And as you look at the 4 points agreement we made in November 2014, we actually had reached the agreement over how you can understand and interpret the issue over the East China Sea. And if you look at the 70th anniversary statement, Abe actually didn't go in line with the nationalistic footsteps to reflect his own view on the statement, but it is more like a consensus view to be reflected. And then finally comes to our relation with Korea. In December last year, we finally made a solution on the Call for Women issue. By and large, this is a very pragmatic steps, and which makes the impression that the Abe administration is taking very seriously about the relation with neighbors.
All right, we want to hear different voices. Professor Watanabe, what about the history issue? Is Abe administration following rather a peaceful way or rather an irritating way to its neighbors?
Historical issues, especially symbolized by the Yasukuni Shrine, where the war criminals are enshrined, these things could be utilized by the Abe administration and also supporters of the LDP conservative side. And when the cabinet is put into endangered position, they want to use that kind of the symbol to get the more support from the people, or they want to make the eyes of the people towards something diplomatic with the foreign countries. This time, China is very important because former Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda suggested to the people through the media that China should be one of the members of the G7. G7 meeting will be organized in May in Japan. And also Mr. Fukuda suggested that in the coming May summit, the issue whether or not we should welcome China as the member of G7 should be discussed. This political process is changing the environment of the politics.
Okay. First of all, history, very briefly coming from you, Mr. Yang. Of course, revision, as I mentioned, the textbooks and the constitution changes as well. These are all big topics here in China. Can Chinese diplomat like Mr. Wang Yi, together with his Japanese counterparts, be able to overcome this kind of public sentiment and overcome, in a way, what history has already agreed, and therefore ignore these historical issues and move forward? Can that be possible? And should that be possible?
Well, no way to overcome such a complicated and long-time problems laying in the bilateral relation. But anyway, the bilateral foreign minister meeting will at least create a better atmosphere.
Well, I want you to hold here, Mr. Yang, because we all remember last November, back in the year 2014, when Chinese President Xi Jinping met with the Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Abe, during the APEC summit. Of course, it was a trilateral or multilateral platform, but still they shook hands, and everyone saw it. People expect things to get better. However, it did not. It probably even get worse given all the circumstances. So, Mr. Yang, is it practical that we are expecting another top official meeting to make things happen?
Well, that's why you mentioned the quotation said, no, now the ball is at the Japanese court, simply because besides the two old issues, the one new issue, why the shape of the bilateral relation is getting worse after the top leaders meeting. They could be better, but why worse? Because a new issue, new problem emerged. So I think if Japan regard China, the key question is how Japan regard China.
That's very interesting. Let me come back to you. Mr. Kimball earlier talking about that Japan look at China as a strategic partner, but then it seems that nothing is suggesting that about happening. It sounds like strategic opposition.
Well, I would rather say optimistic view on this regard, because Japan and China has immediate need for cooperation on various fields. Take example about the North Korean issues. After the missile launch and the nuclear test, we negotiated very deeply at the UN Security Council and came up with the security resolution. And we need to step up and follow up how to implement that on that issue. And then come back to the G7, G20. We're holding G7. We need to coordinate the stance on that. G20, we're visiting China, and we expect to have a summit meeting once again. So there are various types of strategic and also a more technical bureaucratic issue that we can both have to negotiate on that issue. So this is why practically we need to come to China, have a face-to-face meeting, and then come up with the solutions.
But when you have strategic differences, is a consultation going to solve the problem? For example, a multilateral issue like the Korean Peninsula or the G7 issue, Japan pushed at the foreign minister level to include the disputes between China and Japan on the territory into the G7 declaration, and China, of course, immediately expressed dissatisfaction about that. Will that be a beautiful introduction to this specific ministerial meeting?
Well, diplomacy has both fronts. You need to have like a realistic rivalry issues. At the same time, you need to explore the cooperation. As for the South China Sea issue, which was discussed in G7, we didn't really target or name specific country, but we actually stick to the principle of the freedom of navigation.
All right.
In that regard, that I think we will pursue those kind of universal value to be expressed during the summit.
All right, we heard your voice. Mr. Yang, please respond.
Well, I think everyone knows the unnamed declaration or joint statement is aimed at China and especially Japanese increasing involvement in South China Sea activities really make the things there getting worse rather than getting better. The logic is the issue relating to South China Sea primarily is the responsibility of the countries surrounding that area. And Japan, unfortunately, is not the surrounding area. Just like if something happened in Japan, Sea of Japan, that is the responsibility of Russia, the two Koreas, Japan, and other. So by the same token, the increasing involvement by Japan in South China Sea really contains some strategic purposes against China. That's, I say, new issue emerging in the bilateral
All right.
relations.
We understand Japan-China's relations is not just about geopolitical, it's also economic. China-Japan's relationship have been politically tense for years, but economic ties between the two countries deepened. China is Japan's largest trading partner. We all know that. Japan's trade with China has overtaken the U.S., taking up over 20% of the country's total volume for the past 9 years. But China's economic reliance on Japan has further declined. In 2015, for example, China's trade with Japan only accounted for 7% of China's total, compared with nearly 16% back in the year 2003. So my final question to you, Professor Watanabe, despite all of these grassroots contacts between the two countries started from the 1970s, and also the economic reliance on one another over the decades, even though things are changing, where is China and Japan relations, strategically speaking? We can talk about the issues, but most importantly, it's how the two countries are looking at one another now, and also very important in the future. Professor Watanabe.
Geographical characteristics is very, very important. And so the matters happening in Asia must be settled in the ASEAN +3 structure. I mean that the 3 means Korea, Japan, and China. And this is very important. If not, something different comes in to the power structure of the Asian nations. So this might bring something strange.
All right.
And also, as the process of the politics, we should have the softening power of the, you see, the safety valve. This is the meeting between China's foreign minister and Japanese foreign minister, Kishida, this time.
All right. We're running out of time, but of course, this is such a huge topic, Japan and China relations. Well, I'm sure we'll have many opportunities to explore this. We hope this specific meeting will bear at least some fruits. Yang Xiyu, Ken Jimbo, and Takasaka Watanabe. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. Now that the excitement around the Iranian nuclear deal has settled, what challenges lie ahead for the U.S. and Iran? Iranian's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs has some thoughts for us. We also discuss potential impact of Road and Belt initiatives on Sino-Iranian ties. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News, and welcome back. Last summer, the so-called P5+1 world powers reached a historical deal with Iran. It ended decades of economic sanctions against the country in exchange for restrictions on its nuclear program. The deal is intended to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, bring its economy back onto the world stage, and equally important, demonstrate that diplomacy can bring about meaningful changes even today. Now, months have passed. How has the deal been implemented by all sides, especially Iran and the U.S., which used to have further unilateral sanctions against Iran? Morteza Sarmadi is the first Vice Foreign Minister of Iran. I caught him on the sideline of SICA Foreign Minister Conference in Beijing. A seasoned diplomat from Iran, he reflected upon the nuclear deal, challenges of its implementation, and even what inspirations it might provide to other crises going on in the world today, such as the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. But first, some background information.
A historic deal. It took almost a decade to finally reach consensus on Iranian nuclear issues. The implementation will likely be less marathon-like, but won't be entirely smooth either, experts say, especially when it comes to the U.S. side. For example, there are some $2 billion in frozen Iranian assets. The money, held in a Citibank trust account in New York, was expected by Iran to be returned to its central bank. But recently, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that it must be turned over to American families of people killed in the 1983 bombing of a U.S. Marine Corps barracks in Beirut and other attacks blamed on Iran. Then, there are over 30 metric tons of heavy water to be dealt with. A sales agreement between the U.S. Energy Department and a subsidiary of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran was signed in Vienna last Friday. Although the water will then be resold on the commercial market for research purposes, congressional Republicans are apprehensive of the sale. They say that in the name of protecting the nuclear deal, Iran should produce more heavy water to sell on the international market. These divisions could pose significant barriers, especially as the results of the upcoming U.S. presidential election are difficult to predict. The question is, with these uncertainties in sight, which side should be more worried, Iran or the U.S.?
This change should not be considered as a coup d'etat in a third world country. So this is the image of American, the responsibility of American, whether when they come to a deal, when they promise, and when they, commit themselves to a deal. This is something that the other presidents and the next president should do it. So we acknowledge the President of the United States and this administration for implementation of this deal, and I think that it's also important for them not to give such an image of themselves.
According to Secretary Kerry from the United States, at least there are 50 to 100 billion US dollars of frozen funds should be, in a way, provided to Iran as a result of this deal. How much has been done already?
We have these assets, but the problem is that transferring in the banking system is not totally possible yet. The United States and the other parties should do I mean, their commitments.
This is only one area. The other area is about something included in the deal. For example, the purchase of heavy water coming from Iran by United States and some of the other countries. At this moment, we understand one Democrat senator in the U.S. blocked the bill of energy, in which includes this specific clause of purchasing heavy water from Iran. What do you make of this latest development? What, once again, can Iran do?
Really, we think that the government of the United States is responsible for carrying out this deal. But unfortunately, there are some circles in the United States that try to blockade and not to permit that this deal can be implemented. I think the selling of this heavy water was a part of this commitment, and we were committed to make available this heavy water in the market. So now, because of the quality of this heavy water, one American company has come and purchased this. So the other parties can do the same. But I think this is the responsibility of the government, of the U.S. administration, to solve the internal problems and to manage these differences.
But what about internal reactions from your own country? I mean, after all, this is considered to be one of the biggest deals for decades for Iran. And people are expecting funds to be unfrozen, more interactions with the rest of the world, more business opportunities. What would this rather slow process of implementation mean for your domestic constituency?
Despite all these expectations from the negotiation team and the normal expectation of the people that they should feel the tangible results of lifting of sanctions, I think in our people there is such an understanding that they give this time and opportunity, whether the other parties, especially United States, is a credible party that in the future you can rely on its agreements.
After more than 10 years of Iran being cut off from the rest of the world by sanctions, this is going to be a very slow process at the very beginning. But I would also assume, when looking at politics elsewhere, this would mean certain pressure for both your president, who has been very vocal in the negotiation, and also for the foreign ministry, who have been, including you yourself, Mr. Vice Minister, and with the Mr. Minister, working very hard over the years for this deal. Eventually, the negotiation was done by you guys. So what would that mean politically, pressure?
If we consider as a whole this process, I think before we come to a final judgment, it's better to give time whether all the pressures, encouraging of the other countries, and the credibility of the countries in keeping their promises works or not. But I'm sure that even in the United States, there is a tendency, there are some tendencies that not to allow these pressure groups or some hardline circles to overcome or to show that, to prove that diplomacy does not work.
Very interesting. The nuclear development, of course, in Iran earlier has a lot to do with how Iran sees its own security and also its own economic development. But of course, after the agreement was signed, Iran should carry out its own commitment. On the other hand, the question has arisen, which is how Iran is going to have a new set of strategies to guarantee its security in the future, not only in the region, but also globally as well.
I think that the issue of security for defining our nuclear program was a fabricated one. They tried to show that Iran pursuing a military one, but it was not correct. exactly at the end, they came to this conclusion that we had a peaceful one. And now maybe the new threats are in a different manner. Now extremism and terrorism are threatening the security of the world. So we need a collective effort for fighting against terrorism and extremism. I think that now Iran has shown that even when it had its own nuclear program, it was something related to the economic development. It was something that returned to Iranians feeling that sometimes they have to stand on their own feet. They need a kind of independence and self-reliance in very important and sensitive issues. And sometimes, as you at the beginning of our interview, the reaction of some countries to this deal, maybe it proves that still Iran needs further guarantees from the other sides for, entering to some security arrangements. But we have carried out a stand and position that we think that legitimacy comes from our people when the people of a country are supporting their own government. It's the best guarantee for their security. So I think that we have shown a genuine effort for eliminating the legitimate concerns in the security, in the framework of security.
The Iran agreement was considered a very successful one after a long time of negotiations. And many compare that, even though there are so many differences, with what's going on now on the Korean Peninsula, the nuclear crisis. From your perspective, how did you see these two case studies? What can be some of the things that you and other partners achieved that can be of inspiration for the other case study?
It's very difficult to, compare the cases exactly, but I think as a whole, it's important that we give this opportunity for talks and dialogue. This is very important. At least in Iran nuclear program, it worked. And we hope that by full implementation of this deal, everybody, completely feels that it works. This is something, this expectation. But we need really a world free of nuclear weapons. This is something that we pursuing, and this is our policy that in all the parts of the world we need to get rid of nuclear weapons. As well as the external intervention. We think that sometimes and always, this is our policy, that external intervention makes the situation more complicated. And we need that to stop these types of interventions, or that some countries think that they have the right to intervene in any parts of the world. So by eliminating these two concerns and to work in parallel on these two issues, I'm sure that maybe in Korean Peninsula will be able to find a political solution.
The nuclear deal should clear the way ahead for Iran. The nation is now able to spend more time pushing ties with the rest of the world, including China, a big power with which it has long enjoyed cooperation. An independent and trustful country. That's how Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei described China for its cooperation during the sanctions era. Chinese President Xi Jinping was the first foreign head of state to visit Iran after its nuclear issue was resolved. The two ancient civilizations plan to increase bilateral trade to $600 billion over the next decade and elevate their ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership, carrying forward their millennia-old friendship. Their exchanges and conflict-free cooperation dates back 2,000 years, thanks to the Silk Road. And the China-led Belt and Road Initiative is expected to push those ties even further in this post-deal era.
What about after this? Some were suggesting Iran was giving a very good deal to the European counterparts when it comes to the oil and energy prices. Many wonder, will that be the same to Iran's trade partners, which has been with Iran for decades?
Undoubtedly, we will not forget our friends during the hard time, and China was one of our friends, and we had a good tradition of working before the sanctions, during the sanctions, and we hope that after the lifting of sanctions we will continue this trend. The visit of the President of China to Iran and very good agreements, and especially the strategic partnership between two countries, shows that there is a strong will in Iran for continuing a good, a very good relationship with China, and this is our understanding that there are many areas that China can participate in aftermath of the sanctions, economic development of Iran. It's maybe the impact of these problems, which I mentioned before, also has overshadowed the more activity of banking system of a China, or financial system of China. But we think that further activity of investors, Chinese investors, for direct investment as well as financing projects, will bring a very bright future for the economic and trade relation of Iran and China. I think that if you compare our relationships and the familiarity of Iranian market and businessmen with China, as well as the absence of European companies during these 4 or 5 years, it has created a better opportunity for Chinese companies, and they have such a privilege that they can keep their important role in Iranian market.
There's also China's proposal of One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road Initiative. Certainly Iran is a very important position. How can Iran also jump on this train?
I think when we look to the future of China, the role which China is playing in the world economy, in the global economy, it's very natural that the Chinese are pursuing some initiatives to be compatible with such a way. And the One Belt, One Road is one of these initiatives that includes many countries. And Iran, with the very good tradition of cooperation with China, can play an important role. And this is something that we always have shown our preparedness to work with China in order to define a comprehensive plan that can fill this puzzle as a whole. There are some gaps that can be filled by Iran and Iranian economy, which is one of the growing economies after sanctions. So I think there are many benefits in this cooperation in the framework of One Belt, One Road with China.
Any specific example you can give?
I think that the access, the transit roads between China and different markets in Europe, in Caucasus, in some parts of Arab countries. Iran is a very stable and safe country. When we are talking about the transit roads or transit routes, one of the main elements for considering a way as a transit is the security and stability. So I'm sure that in any assessment, in any analysis, when China is looking for further access to the other markets, Iran is inevitably one of, the main ways for such a purpose.
How does Iran start your process of re-engaging with the international community? Is there a specific roadmap you're having in mind?
I think that after this deal with the P5+1, now Iran is a market that many countries think that for their own economic growth they need to work and cooperate with Iran. And we have opened our market. But we have some, I cannot say preconditions, but we have something in our mind that for the future of our economy, we need a kind of partnership with the other countries, that they can invest in Iran. We need a shared and joint venture, not a pure trade with the other countries. Now, many leaders of many countries have understood that they can work with Iran as a regional power. Iran's role cannot be ignored.
That's Morteza Sarmadi, Vice Foreign Minister from Iran. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight, CCTV News into your search engine, or also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next week for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night and have a great weekend.